Ever had that experience where you queue for level 50, 60, 70, 80 dungeons roulette and you land somewhere and think, I have no idea where this is, but I have clearly been here before? This video is dedicated to 10 dungeons that you possibly completely forgot, or maybe never even knew existed. And for a little fun, I have ranked the dungeons based on which ones I think were more likely to be forgotten. Number 10. Sastasha. Hard. An entirely optional revisit to the first dungeon, Sastasha. This dungeon's only other claims to fame these days is that the first boss is a way to get the Blue Mage spell Tailscrew, and the last boss is the only way to get Inkjet for Blue Mages. Unfortunately, both spells are vastly inferior to other Blue Mage options, meaning they are only worth your time for collection. With that said, what makes this dungeon somewhat interesting story-wise is that most of the humanoid enemies are actually the same people that were there originally, except they have all been turned by Leviathan into some actually horrendous creatures. The first boss actually has the capacity to almost instantly kill someone with its Tailscrew attack. The second boss, Captain Madison, and the final boss, the Kraken, instead are weird gimmick fights that sort of requires you to kill a lot of ads. For Captain Madison, it is somewhat clear since you simply kill the actual mobs there. For the Kraken, it seems a lot less clear since it feels like those tentacles can just keep coming back, even though they don't really. The Kraken also comes with a really big arena, which sometimes causes reach problems for healers and tanks, interestingly. Among all the trash packs, specifically the ones with these Serpent Ladies can be particularly scary, not for the Serpent Ladies themselves, but actually because of the brine. If the brine reaches the mob in the center of the room, she heals. If you instead decide to attack the brine, which you probably do with AoE anyway, then they explode for AoE damage, and that can be quite surprising in the moment. Overall, not exactly a super difficult dungeon, but when a dungeon is mostly memorable because of relation to a different memorable dungeon, that's usually not a good sign. Number 9. Hullbreaker Isle. Another A Realm Reborn dungeon that is entirely optional, in this case with no relation to a previous dungeon, making it even more easily forgettable. This one somehow feels almost more likely to only be found in things like Mentor Roulette than in 50, 60, 70, 80. This dungeon is filled with weird gimmicks and mechanics which specifically can make it awkward or even difficult on your first go through. In the area before the first boss, there's a ton of small bear traps that fall in with the terrain if you don't actually realize they're very real and hurt a lot. Consider that the enemies can also step in them. The first boss has a mechanic where he spams an AoE attack until you pull down a banana for him. Doing so gives him a damage bonus, and it isn't unusual for multiple people to do it at once by accident, giving him multiple damage boosts. Power creep has made that almost irrelevant though. Before the second boss, there are these chests you need to open, but some of them are mimics, and some of them have the items you require to progress. And the second boss has a mechanic where you have to enter a bubble at a specific time to avoid damage from a mechanic. There's a limited amount of bubbles, so if you waste too many by accident, then you may have to just eat the damage. Which, again, is somewhat manageable, especially for a tank, because of power creep. And the final boss, the Kraken, again, has this gimmick with tentacles, again. But this time it is accompanied by a mechanic where you have to jump between platforms, and each jump gives you a debuff that stacks that people tend to forget about and sometimes just die outright as a result. Did you know that Sastasha Hard was released one patch after Hullbreaker Isle? Pretty funny they used the same boss twice in a row like that. Number 8. Akadaemia Anyder. One of the 2 optional dungeons of Shadowbringers, this one in particular having not really anything stand out about it, and the quest to unlock it being situated in a zone so far away from everything else that you could easily never return to it once Shadowbringers is finished. The very first wall-to-wall pull in the dungeon is rather long, and it isn't uncommon for even a warrior to require Holmgang to get it done. This isn't too surprising, since other parts of the dungeon also have more complex mobs that can hurt a lot more if you don't deal with them appropriately. This includes stunning or interrupting sudden party-wide AoEs and the like. The first boss being a tag team of these shark creatures which turn up again later in the MSQ is quite interesting in retrospect, and their mechanic of tag teaming with two distinctly different movesets can also take first timers by surprise. The second boss being one of these mega marbles is also quite interesting, since it is kind of like a callback to that mechanic in Dawn Meg. But the real unique fight here is Quetzalcoatl, the final boss. It both has a mechanic where it puts down orbs you're supposed to grab, which increases your damage, or the boss's damage instead if you don't, and then it has this mechanic where it shoves you to one end and has you run towards it dodging mechanics to the other. It is an interesting dungeon, but is easily missed entirely due to its placement. Interesting especially somehow compared to its counterpart, the Twinning, which we all know and love. Number 7. The Temple of the Fist, one of Stormblood's entirely optional dungeons that doesn't even unlock anything after it. The particular memorable thing about this dungeon is it being the source of the Blue Mage spell, the Rose of Destruction. Aside from that, there isn't anything super standout about it. For the bosses, we have the two quirls where you simply kill one off when the second one spawns. Next, we have Arboretum, which is an interesting fight that both makes use of weird names for angled AoEs, such as fore and aft and port and star, mechanics where you have to stand in a specific spot based on a marker, and countering attacks from specific sides just like Ravana does. Finally, Ivan Curlfist himself! Who? Which, similar to Quetzalcoatl, has a mechanic where you have to steal orbs from him to weaken him. He also has a bunch of other attacks, but the most standout among them is Touch of Slaughter, which sets someone's HP to just about 1, and that someone, notably, can be the tank, so that can be a bit scary. Number 6. Kugane Castle. The other entirely optional dungeon of Stormblood that unlocks nothing. Throughout the entire dungeon, both one of the bosses and multiple trash packs include these explodey boys that need to be dealt with and potentially ran away from. That is, by the way, the standout mechanic of the first boss as well. Before the second boss, there are also several ninja summoners that spawn extra adds if not killed, and at a certain point, these summoners may be too numerous to stop all of them. The thing is, the adds aren't particularly threatening when it comes to it. The second boss also regularly summons adds of their own, and is also the source of the Blue Mage spell Tatami Gaiji, which is okay I guess, but there are many other better alternatives that do the same thing. The final boss, Yojimbo, is actually a bit of a shame, because such a cool character is so easily missed. If only the fight with Yojimbo was a trial, and no, the one in the Hildebrand story does not count, that isn't even Yojimbo. Anyway, his mechanic is the rich man in the back, throwing money on the field that you have to grab first to make sure his gauge doesn't rise too much. This isn't really a problem with 4 players though. Number 5. The Fractal Continuum. Hard. While regular Fractal Continuum isn't massively memorable in its own right as an optional dungeon, its unlock being prominently placed in Ishgard already helps its chances significantly. The hard version, however, requires you to have already beaten that other easier to miss optional dungeon. Some interesting details about this dungeon is that multiple trash packs include Minotaur adds that are a callback to one of the bosses in the normal version of the dungeon. For the actual bosses here, Motherbit has a mechanic where it places down an AoE that lasts quite a while that cuts your HP in half, which is fitting since the spell is gravity. It also uses those Magitech bits to do a wall of line AoEs like how Ultima Weapon does these days. The Ultima Warrior, in similarity to Ultima Weapon, has mechanics based on the Warring Triad instead of the Elemental Primals. The final boss, Ultima Beast, looks more like the original Ultima Weapon from Final Fantasy VI, and interestingly, actually has a DPS check near the end where it casts Demi Ultima, which will wipe the group if it finishes. This is usually not an issue though, but still an interesting little detail. Oh yeah, this is also the dungeon where these Minotaur adds bonk on the glass. Number 4. Saint Mocianne's Arboretum. Hard. This harder version of yet another entirely optional dungeon has an overarching feature of enemies being muddied up, which makes them behave differently, which at times can be interacted with by cleaning the mobs. Being tucked away as a hard version of a weirdly niche, entirely optional dungeon tucked away in the Dravanian hinterlands, you know, outside Idleshire, where people rarely travel to without a specific purpose, certainly doesn't help against making this dungeon even more obscure than the normal version. The first boss, being one of those big chew creatures, is quite interesting, but it doesn't have anything particularly stand out about it aside from this sudden jump and then cleave the room attack. The second boss, on the other hand, has a mechanic that might look very familiar if you've done Lunar Subterrane recently. A bit of a case of can I copy your homework, isn't it? And the final boss has this gimmick of placing down mud balls that can be pushed around and requiring you to place them somewhere somewhat specific to avoid the mud splashes coming from below, because if you don't, it'll hurt a lot. This is also the boss that teaches blue mages the, again, somewhat unneeded spell Feculent Flood, as there are simply many better options than it. Number 3. Neverreap. An optional Heavensward dungeon with a name that makes you expect something different, I feel. The most significant feature of the trash in the dungeon are these moving tornadoes that might look familiar if you have entered the Criterion version of Alo Alo Island. With that said, each of the bosses have a little something to highlight. The first one has a mechanic where it covers the arena in mist, so you have to find the boss and hurt it enough to cancel out of the mechanic. The second boss has a mechanic of placing down totems and requiring you to move them around to not be in the revival zone that the boss puts down, somewhat reminiscent of Grand Cosmos. The final boss has two interesting mechanics. The first one being summoning adds around the arena and making the boss do damage to anyone that touches it while you have to deal with the adds. The second mechanic that follows immediately after is a massive knockback that pushes you almost half of the length of the arena, so incorrect positioning can be lethal. Number 2. Sohm. Hard. What really doesn't help this one is that normal Sohm has to do with climbing upwards and fighting dragons. Sohm Hard has to do with going downwards and fighting random beasts and scorpions, which makes the relation to Sohm difficult to connect. With that said, the first boss uses this mechanic where it puts down spore sacks that do AoEs every so often. And because the boss has a frontal cone attack with little warning, the tank may have more difficulty with positioning as a result of a combination of these mechanics. The second boss is a big two-legged crocodile creature and uses the body shape that matches the classic no telegraphs mobs. Indeed, it uses the classic sets of frontal cone swipe, 360 swipe, shoot a fireball, line AoE, charge, and tail swipe, somewhat similar to the ones from Stone Vigil Hard. Finally, the very uniquely named Lava Scorpion has a set of mechanics all focused on minimizing space, a bit like the first boss. It itself and its adds are capable of putting down fire puddles that gradually increase in size with each AoE slam done. The boss also removes some of the arena at some point early in the fight, to really emphasize the importance of space in this fight. However, there is a reasonable chance the average group won't ever run short of space to be in these days due to power creep. Number 1. Hullbreaker Isle. Hard. Yes, you might be shocked that there is a hard version of this one at all. Think about that, a hard version of an already easy to forget dungeon. The first boss is literally just a gauntlet of adds with different mechanics. There isn't anything threatening enough to require a specific kill order, and the amount of waves are just many enough that you start to wonder if you're doing something wrong why they keep spawning. The second boss, this snail, has a lightning tether that, similar to the vault, requires you to separate. It also places down slime circles that block the damage from these orange markers, which don't do enough damage to worry about actually. And then the boss also freezes the floor and puts AoEs on everyone, which then explodes again shortly after, requiring you to run away. Or rather, slide away, I guess. The final boss, Marshal Slafiasin, also has some mechanics, one of which is pronouncing his name apparently, it feels like. He puts poison on everyone and places chests that can hold the cure. He can also put a heavy debuff on someone and then target them with a large AoE. Finally, he also places down kegs that you can push around that he himself activates to detonate shortly after by shooting them. Hilariously, he also has a super long cast time raid-wide that suggests you're supposed to do something against it, but you can't do anything other than heal up and be ready for it, although it doesn't do that much damage. So did any of these dungeons bring back some old forgotten memories? Maybe you got to think of a dungeon that everyone might have forgotten about too? I would love to hear about it in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, this might be entirely obvious for those that paid attention, but the Sage tutorial quest at level 70 actually takes place in St. Mocianne's Arboretum. By comparison, Reaper's tutorial quest at level 70 takes place in Cutter's Cry.